Recently, I was talking to a friend about the difference between emotional abuse and emotional neglect, and how often we can accidentally view emotional neglect as if it's not as bad. And that is so far from the truth. In fact, I view emotional neglect kind of like carbon monoxide. So I travel back and forth regularly to Mexico. And I was reading an article not too long ago about how this whole family sadly passed away and they couldn't find anything wrong. There was no evidence of foul play. They just sadly passed away at the table. They were all gathered around for a meal. And then, sure enough, they realized that it was carbon monoxide poisoning and there was no carbon monoxide detector. And I know that's a horrible, horrible way to start this video. And I put up that trigger warning to let you know. But the reason I brought this up is because that is exactly how I feel what happens to targets of emotional neglect, especially by covert narcissists. No, they may not lose their physical life. That's true. But nor do they feel alive. You wind up getting stuck in survival. You wind up with a nervous system that is so overwhelmed that you can't even enjoy life. And so that's why I feel this topic is so very important. That being said, let's dive in. For those that don't know me, my name is Michele. I'm a certified trauma-informed recovery coach. I'm also a somatic experiencing practitioner and the founder of the Thriver School of Transformation, which is a monthly membership where we meet live on Zoom weekly and we do the inner work together. Make sure you check out this link if you think that might be a good resource for you. So when it comes to emotional abuse involves any non-physical behavior that is done with the purpose to belittle another person. It can include insults, verbal threats, or any tactic verbally or behaviorally that causes the victim to feel threatened, inferior, ashamed, or degraded. So those would be crimes of commission, things that a person is doing. When it comes to emotional neglect, it has the same end game, but it's done differently. And so it can be like that carbon monoxide. We can miss that it's happening, and yet we see the effects in our body. We see the effects in our personality, in our behavior. And so emotional neglect is done by crimes of omission. What is omitted from the relationship that should be there. And so by definition, emotional neglect is a relationship pattern where an individual's emotional or affectional needs are consistently disregarded, ignored, invalidated, or unappreciated by a significant other, whether it's by a parent, family member, or a romantic relationship. And remember, since both have the same end game, sometimes it can be easy to think that emotional abuse is worse because it's something that's being done to you, and emotional neglect is not as bad. But the reality is, it is just as damaging. It's like comparing someone that might drown in 1 foot of water compared to somebody that drowns in 10 feet of water. It doesn't matter how it was done. The end result was the same. And so the reason I stress this is because I know with myself, in some relationships that I was in, I stayed because it was very hard for me to detect the emotional neglect. Because what tends to happen is we wind up in romantic relationships that play out similar patterns in our childhood. Because emotional neglect was familiar, it woke up things in me that made it difficult for me to understand what was happening. And we wind up showing up from those childlike pieces of us in relationships, because when it happened in childhood, what did we do? We blamed ourselves and we tried harder. And so when emotional neglect happens in our adult relationships, when it wakes up those childlike wounds that we haven't healed yet, we show up the same way. Instead of realizing the other person's behavior is inappropriate and unloving and unkind and abusive or neglectful, we think it's our fault and we try harder. So that's why it's so important to understand this and to really start breaking out of the patterns that are often in place from childhood. So we're going to talk about some symptoms of emotional neglect, how covert narcissists inflict them, and then in the end of the video, we'll talk about what to do about them. So the first one I wanted to mention is difficulty regulating emotions. If you have a hard time feeling your feelings, it's difficult for you to feel balanced in the feeling. So let's say something upsets you. The degree to being upset may far outweigh what is going on in the moment. That would be a sign of not being able to regulate your emotions. If you feel emotionally triggered, then it might take you a long time to feel like you're back in your body again. Another way this shows up in narcissistic relationships is when you can't feel comfortable, grounded, or feeling at peace inside unless or until the other person is happy or is content in some way, shape, or form. For example, if the narcissist gets very angry, even if it's for a reason that doesn't make sense, it's very unsettling inside. It's very difficult for you to feel okay. You don't feel safe until or unless they are okay. So the reason that happens is because if you had a narcissistic parent in childhood or in an adult relationship, that person never validates your feelings. That person never lets you know that you're allowed to have your feelings. Maybe they completely ignore what you're feeling. They tell you you're too sensitive. They tell you that you're making a big deal out of nothing. And so your feelings are never mirrored. Your feelings are never worked through. And so your emotions and your emotional needs are so disregarded and they're treated so poorly that you never learn how to be with your own feelings, how to emotionally regulate yourself, because you've never had that done in childhood. And sadly, that comes into relationships. And there's nothing a narcissist likes more than to regulate your emotions for you, because they need to regulate you to regulate themselves. And so it just becomes a big mess. Another sign of emotional neglect is when you persistently have this feeling of emptiness or numbness. It can look different from person to person, but it's as if there's a piece of you that is just not there, a piece of you that feels disconnected. And this leads you to feeling like you're drifting in life or on autopilot. The crazy thing is with this one is if I had read this when I was really young, I would have completely identified with this. This is how I would describe it. I was a teenager and I remember looking at people and saying, they have a hole in them, they don't. They have a hole in them, they don't. Like I could look at people and know who was whole and who wasn't. Now, I had no idea what I was talking about. The reality was there was a piece of me that was empty, and I could see and I could detect it in other people too. But it's like this feeling that there's something missing inside of you. And what's missing is the invalidated feelings that I went through in childhood and then in adult relationships. It's like there was an emotional chip that was missing. When you're in relationships with covert narcissists that make you feel like your feelings are bad, your brain and your nervous system rewire around your emotions. They help you to live life not feeling, not because your brain and your nervous system is your enemy, but because it thinks it's helping you. If emotions caused you shame, caused you to feel rejection, especially by your parents, then your brain and your nervous system are all about survival, and they rewired around your emotions. And then we grow up as adults and we're like, where's the emotional defibrillator, right? We feel disconnected from ourselves. It's very hard to let other people help us. There's an aversion to depending on other people. So think about it. If you had a narcissistic parent in childhood that you could not depend on, right? They were not reliable. They were not there to meet your emotional needs. Then letting someone else in, allowing someone to be there for you emotionally can be extremely uncomfortable, because the people that you would expect to be there for you emotionally never were. This creates an overcoupling in your nervous system where trusting others, letting others be there for you was met with a lot of pain, and that gets locked in your nervous system. And so you go to be in relationships and it's extremely difficult. Sometimes the only thing that feels safe is isolation. Another sign is you have a critical self-perception. Remember, in childhood, if you had a narcissistic parent that never mirrored you, that never showed you that you mattered, simply by giving you attention, attunement, validation, by removing those things from that relationship, it causes you to create a negative self-image of yourself. You don't see any good in yourself. You have negative beliefs like, I don't matter, I'm unworthy. If you start to be successful in your adult life, you can often feel like you have imposter syndrome. Because again, in childhood, we need that validation. As adults, we don't. It's nice. And in relationships, it feels good and it should exist in relationships. But in childhood, it's a necessity. A child can't validate themselves. And so without validation, without mirroring, without attunement, without having your emotions matter to somebody else, it's very difficult to be able to do that for yourself in your adult life, because you didn't experience it in your childhood. You wind up putting everyone up here and yourself way down at the bottom. Lack of self-compassion. So again, with emotional neglect, maybe the abuser never says anything horrible to you, but they also don't extend compassion, acceptance, unconditional love. And it can be done in so many covert ways. Sometimes it's not by telling you that you do anything bad, but it's always by indirectly comparing you to other people. I know some parents that will compare siblings. Well, your brother or your sister's like this, and they're amazing. And maybe they don't say anything negative to the other child, but they don't have to, because the child is going to take that in as something negative. I know in-laws that use that same logic with their daughter or son-in-laws, where they will highlight all their other children-in-laws as if they're amazing, and then simply not say anything to that one that they're talking to. Now, again, they're not saying anything bad. It can look like nothing is happening, but they are indirectly raising other people up, seeing the good in others, and not showing any kind of emotional compassion, acceptance, or support to the person they're talking to. And in narcissistic family systems, if you're the target of that system, what you'll notice is that the covert narcissists, they give compassion to other people. They just don't give it to you. And so if you're around that for a long time, you wind up internalizing that. If you never got compassion in childhood, or if you go a long period of time in an adult relationship where there's no compassion for you, but there's compassion for friends, there's compassion for your family, your extended family, your significant other shows compassion for them, for everyone but you, it can result in internalizing that as well. And then there's no self-compassion. And so again, it's not insults. It's not anything harshly done or said. It's a lack of compassion. And again, it's damaging to you because of how it causes you to treat yourself. You wind up giving compassion to everyone but you, just like the narcissist did, right? They gave compassion to everyone but you. As a result, you probably struggle with boundaries. You probably take on way more than feels good for you. But since you don't have that compassion for self, you don't listen to yourself. You listen to other people's needs and not your own. Something else that I see a lot is when somebody's been through emotional neglect, they struggle with guilt, shame, and self-blame. The reason that you wind up feeling so much guilt and shame is because, again, with covert narcissists, it's not that they tell you that you don't matter or that your needs or emotions don't matter. They show it through what they don't do. If you put down a boundary, they may not tell you that you're a bad person, but they'll say something like, oh, you don't love me. You do that. That's a lack of love. I don't feel loved when you do that. And so they twist a healthy behavior and they make it sound like it's a bad behavior, like you're not giving enough, like you're not thinking about them. And so when the pattern is set in childhood, where a parent has made you feel guilt anytime you have a need, anytime you feel an emotion, and then they make you feel shame by making you feel like there's something wrong with that emotion, what a child will do is they won't blame their parent. They will blame themselves. It is more safe for a child to be like, oh, it's my fault. I have to try harder. I have to not care about that because I'm selfish if I think about my needs. I'm a bad person if I think about my needs. I have to be 150% selfless and take care of everyone but me. When that pattern is set in childhood, we use that and we enter relationships with that. And so the moments where your inner self is really feeling a boundary violation and it's telling you to say no or to do something differently, we want to listen to that voice, right? That wants to put down the boundary, but the intense amount of guilt and shame that comes up in the body is so overwhelming. And then the thought that we're being bad, not that it's conscious, but this belief that gets kicked on that I'm bad for thinking about my needs will push you to disregard your own boundaries and do what the other person wants, which only keeps you stuck in situations, relationships, circumstances that are prolonging your suffering. A covert narcissist will wind up making you feel like their needs are what matter. And that when you're not focusing 24/7 on their needs, that somehow it means you don't love them. They make you feel bad for how you're being. And it just gets all twisted up inside. There's difficulty identifying and expressing emotions. It's really hard to express emotions when you were never allowed to have them, right? And again, it's not because they said don't have them. It's because they never paid attention to them. They never acted like your emotions matter. And so the pain of not having that reflected back causes us, our nervous system and our brain, to step in and be like, emotions are dangerous. Let's stop them. Let's ignore them. Let's compartmentalize them. And so how do we talk about something that our brain automatically, because of its pattern now, puts in this corner of our brain or stifles so far deep into our body that we can't even notice it. And so the effects of this long term is that you wind up entering one-sided relationships, or you're always emotionally exhausted because you're pouring out for everyone but yourself. You're not filling your own cup. And then the amount of energy that your body uses up to keep everything stifled down also causes that exhaustion. If you've undergone emotional neglect, you might really struggle with a sensitivity to rejection. Now, by the way, no one likes rejection. No one's like, oh, yes, I was rejected. No one enjoys it. But if you've undergone emotional neglect, then the pain can feel so overwhelming to your system. It winds up pairing with fear of abandonment, which might be something you're carrying if you had a narcissistic parent or an emotionally unavailable parent. And so sadly, covert narcissists use this sensitivity to rejection to control you. They know you don't want to get rejected. And so when they want their way, while again, we're talking about emotional neglect, they may not say anything harsh to you, but they will withdraw their acceptance and love. They'll give you the silent treatment. They will walk around with this air. They'll tell you everything's fine, but you feel the hostility in their body. That wakes up that fear of abandonment, that pain of rejection, and it usually causes a person to let their boundaries down and do whatever the narcissist wants so you don't feel that discomfort in your own body. Another sign that you might be struggling due to emotional neglect is that it might be really hard for you to be assertive. When we're assertive, we're able to advocate for ourselves. We're able to set boundaries. We're able to go after the things that we want to go after. It shows up in how we enter relationships, in our careers. But if our emotions and needs never mattered to the other person in the relationship, then we don't see our emotional needs as mattering. So maybe we feel we deserve a raise, but we don't ask for it. Maybe we want to say no and set boundaries and only do our work and not the work of 5 other people as well, but we don't say anything. Maybe your significant other is taking care of everyone else but you, but we can't say anything because we just don't feel like we have the voice to be able to do that. So I'm hoping by now that you're seeing that the effects of emotional neglect are extremely damaging. Maybe the narcissist isn't doing anything forcefully, but by what they are withholding from you is causing your personality to almost implode in on itself. And over a long period of time, you wind up feeling as if you've been erased from the inside out. And in a way you have. Your emotions never had space. They never mattered. And so they were erased. The beliefs that you had about yourself, you weren't allowed to have them. They were never mirrored back. They were never supported. So they were erased and replaced with negative beliefs about who you are. And when that pattern takes root inside of us, it causes us to show up in every relationship in that same pattern. And so we wind up, and this is hard. This is a hard truth to swallow, but then we wind up furthering our suffering because we're showing up in these templates, these patterns that it definitely wasn't our fault. We didn't choose that pattern, but now because it's so familiar, we're showing up in it and we're seeing other people continually reflect back to us the same neglect that our caregivers or our long-term romantic partner did as well. So if you're like, yes, this resonates, Michele, this definitely resonates. Now what? Here are a couple of things that you can start to do. First thing is to start looking for your emotions on a day-to-day basis. You don't have to go back to the traumas. You don't have to go back to hard, challenging times and think about what you were feeling at those times. You can start with the day-to-day feelings that you have on a daily basis. And you might be like, Michele, I really don't have any feelings. That's okay. Start with that. Notice, where do you know that you don't have feelings? It might be like this hollowness in your chest. Oh, I have this, I'm trying to feel, and all I feel is hollow. Noticing the hollowness. Noticing if you're numb in a certain area. Because, by the way, if you do notice an area where you feel numb or hollow, it's not that there's no feeling there. It's that there is so much feeling there that your brain and your nervous system has given you some kind of emotional Novocaine so you don't feel it. Because it was deemed dangerous. Feelings were deemed dangerous by your nervous system. And so to keep you safe, it's holding all of it down. When you begin doing this, you might notice that you don't want to feel that. And I get it. Your brain and body has been trying to keep you from feeling those things for a long time. So you're going to feel uncomfortable. So don't stay in it longer than necessary. Stay in it for a moment. The second it starts to feel too much, Start orienting to your surroundings, looking outside, feeling your feet on the ground, touching your body, bringing yourself back to this moment. You might be like, what are you talking about, Michele? The reason I say that is because what's stored here, what's stored as numb and hollow in the body, those are things that took place in the past. And the thing with trauma is that when we get in touch with those pieces of us that are stifled and buried, they wake up almost as if it was the moment it was happening. So it's almost like we somatically time travel to those moments, and it can feel a lot. We can feel like a child. And so when we orient to where we are, we notice, oh, yes, I'm feeling this hollowness, this numbness here in the moment, and I'm in my room, and I see the outside, and I'm looking at this painting, and I'm seeing this plant, and I feel my feet on the ground, and I feel my legs on the chair. It helps us to stay with one foot in the present while we're noticing things that were stifled in the past. This is a way we begin to build our capacity to be with the sensations that we were not allowed to have for a long period of time. The other thing that I wanted to mention that is helpful is to start looking for opportunities where you can show your brain that two people can have separate emotions, emotional states, perspectives. You don't have to have them be the same. The reason I say this is because if you've been in narcissistic relationships, you were not allowed to be your own person. You were not allowed to feel like you could have your own thoughts and your own feelings. And so if the narcissist is mad, it creates an automatic negative emotion in you, like guilt, shame, fear. But when you start to notice that this person can feel that, I don't like it, and I'm still allowed to stay in whatever emotion I'm in. They're allowed to be nasty. I don't like it, but I'm allowed to feel happy, and I'm allowed to feel peace. That takes practice. So something that's helpful is not starting with the narcissist, because narcissists expect you to be exactly as they are or to be the flip side of what they are. And the reason they want that is if they're nasty, then you become nasty. They just regulated themselves. They feel better. But if you stay you, yes, they're going to stay nasty. They may even get nastier. This advice is only for people that know that this person is maybe an emotional abuser, somebody that does emotional neglect, but that does not, there's no fear of this person putting their hands on you. If there's that kind of fear, this advice is not for you. Because it would be hard to start with the narcissist, I encourage you to start with people at work, people in a store, anywhere you go, family members. So it might be you go into a store and the cashier is rude and mean and nasty. And you're like, oh, they're nasty. What am I? I'm feeling happy. I'm having a good day. Okay, they're allowed to be nasty. I'm allowed to be happy. You're at work and maybe you're sad. Maybe you received bad news and the other person is happy. Like, oh, they're happy. Well, they're allowed to be happy. They didn't receive bad news. I'm allowed to stay in the emotion that right now I'm feeling. I'm allowed to validate that emotion. And so that's the key. You start validating your emotions and removing this good, bad, like this is a good emotion, this is a bad emotion. No, all emotions are feedback. So start validating them the way that it should have been done for you with your inner dialogue. So those are a couple of tips that help. In fact, speaking about inner dialogue in Thriver School of Transformation, this month we've been deep diving on that topic. I'll leave the link there for you. We meet on Tuesdays. That's been our monthly theme. And all of the prior meetings are recorded. And we have our last meeting on this topic this coming Tuesday. So if you want to come join us, make sure you check out that link.